Hello everyone, it's November 15th, 2024. We haven't seen each other for ages. I've not been very active on the channel over the past few months, that is true, for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I've been very busy composing. I have a number of pieces I've needed to finish. And the other is that, how do I put this? There are times where I don't have much to say. I'm just focused on other things. And I don't really want to make videos unless I have something to say that I think is worth saying and potentially worth the time of my viewers. So, but now I've gotten quite a number of extremely interesting questions in very recently, and I thought that they were well worth addressing, and I'm grateful for the continued support of my channel and for the continued lively discussions on the channel. So let's get right into it. So the first question is, why do many composers who are famous during their lifetimes completely disappear? I've been listening to Dorothy Howell, the English Strauss. All of her major works were premiered at the proms, but now she is completely unknown. There's never any guarantee of posterity. That's the first thing I'll say. How many of the composers who have won the Pulitzer Prize, for example, do we still remember today? Do you even know any of their names? Probably not. There are many composers who are celebrated in their lifetimes for whom posterity has not held much in store. What are the reasons for that? Well, there are multiple reasons for it. So the composer might respond to a need that exists during their lifetime that doesn't necessarily still exist after they're gone. If you think about the composers whose works are still in some kind of a canon and are still regularly performed, I think there's a number of things that come into play. One of them is that the work still fills a need of some kind in the future. And that's accounting for the fact that the world is obviously constantly changing, but there's nevertheless something about the work that is either universal enough or profound enough or interesting enough so that future generations of people can find something in it to enjoy. So that's one thing. The second thing is that you need people to take care of a composer's legacy, right? So you need editors to make sure that the scores are still being published, are still available, that the texts exist in a performable state. So there are plenty of examples of composers whose works have fallen essentially into disrepair. There are no authoritative editions, or the editions that exist are too full of mistakes to be usable in any kind of practical performance situation, and that's a huge problem. If you can't easily acquire performance materials, scores and parts, and have them be reliable, then it's much less likely that somebody's going to program the pieces. That's been a problem for Carl Ruggles. It's been a problem for Ruth Crawford Seeger as well. It's been a problem for lots of composers. Bruno Maderna is another instance of a composer whose works are performed far less frequently than they would be had the scores been available in some kind of a professionally edited state. And that's just up to the heirs of the estate. It's up to the initiative of private individuals who are going to say, this is a really important composer and I'm going to make sure that these works are preserved properly. It might be up to the foundations that own the works, that own the rights to the works as well. There are all kinds of reasons for that. So there's a composer in Britain called Havergal Brian, for example, who composed some, dozens and dozens of symphonies. And Havergal Brian's music, I think, which is, maybe we don't need to go down that road. I don't think he's a major figure, let's put it that way. Nevertheless, there's a thing called the Havergal Brian Society that has been extraordinarily effective at promoting his work and at ensuring that it continues to get performed. So sometimes it comes down to things like that, and it's a matter of luck. It's like, are there lots of people safeguarding the work, making sure that it exists in a stable state that is widely available and actively promoting it? And if that's not the case, and if the work is not particularly relevant to contemporary concerns, then there's no particular reason to expect that it would continue to be performed, right? So, and posterity is not always fair, and there are lots of very important figures who were major creators during their lifetimes, whose work we unfortunately don't hear anymore today. So, what can you say? It's to a degree, it's a mixture of luck and also the work having certain intrinsic qualities that make it likelier to be handed down to future generations. I'd like to just briefly jump in here and say that this channel exists because of the support that I receive on Patreon. If you are a regular listener and would like to see more of what I do, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/Samuel Andreyev. You'll find the link in the video or podcast description. You'll get exclusive previews, the ability to submit questions, CDs, signed prints, and more. But you can also support my work by subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, or joining in on the discussion through the comment section below. You talked about rhythmic objects which form a recognizable unit as material in your pieces. Do you always start with rhythm and then harmonize it, or are there instances where you first think of harmonic content? Do you see these rhythmic objects independent from the pitch content? Do you even separate both elements? I don't recognize myself in those words. It's possible I may have spoken about rhythmic objects at some point in the past, but I don't know. I doubt that I would have used that exact term. And if I did, then it's an indication that my concerns have evolved quite a lot since I said that. I don't think even the term itself, rhythmic objects, is strange to me. Okay, because rhythm by definition is not an object. Rhythm is something that is continuously moving and changing. And in order to have an object, you have to have something with absolute defined boundaries, and that's just not what rhythm is. So I don't think of it in that sense. Energy. Rhythm is not an object. It's a pattern. For example, it can be an energetic disposition, but it's not an object. And then the idea that you would start with rhythm and then harmonize it. Also, I don't know what that means. Like, how do you harmonize rhythm? Like, rhythm and harmony are two parameters, if you like, of music. But I certainly don't think of it that way. I don't think of it as like you take all of these disparate elements and then snap them together and then you've got a piece. Like you take some rhythms here and then you take some pitches there and you take some timbre and then you put it all together and then you've got, like, no, I don't think of music that way. These are all parts, okay? They're distinct parts that you can label and you can describe, but they have to work together. They have to work together coherently, and ideally they have to be born together. Just like the various parts of the human body, it's like they work together. They're a whole, and you can describe them independently of each other, but you can't really dissociate them from each other in terms of their function. And it's the same with music. All of these different parameters are so tightly interrelated that to speak of them separately in that manner, to me, in terms of where I'm at currently as a musician, that just makes no sense. What would you say is the essence of Western classical music? What makes something Western classical and what makes something not Western classical? To what extent would you consider yourself part of the Western classical tradition? And how has this answer fluctuated for you throughout your life? Maybe it would help to use a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being never heard of it and 10 being full ideological commitment to the cause. Wow. Full ideological commitment to the cause? Well, I'm not an ideologue. Whatever the Western classical tradition is, it's not an ideology. I certainly would hope it's not an ideology, because I'm not a fan of ideologies. That's for sure. No, and I'm not a joiner of causes either. The Western classical tradition is an umbrella that encompasses an enormous variety of styles and approaches and different historical periods and a vast range of geographical areas, right? So it's huge. Does it have a center? Maybe you could say that one of the defining characteristics of it is a preoccupation with polyphony. But that's not to say that it applies to everything. That's just to say that maybe that's what lies at the heart of it. But it's so vast that it can encompass all sorts of things that aren't at the center, but are rather on the edges, on the periphery, right? So, for example, the music of Morton Feldman isn't particularly preoccupied with polyphony. It's got other concerns. I love the music of Feldman. I would never say it's central to the Western musical tradition. It's peripheral to it, but it's great. So yeah, no, I don't think of things in those terms. I just don't. Western classical music can absorb many influences from all over the world. I mean, it's always done that. So I would, if I had to name one characteristic of it that I think sets it apart, from other traditions, and not above. I want to be very clear about that, but apart in terms of, distinct from. Then I think polyphony, the development of polyphony, is an obvious marker, but it's also large enough as a tradition, as I said, to encompass other things as well. Hi Samuel, I enjoyed your Triggernometry interview. What you said at the 11-minute mark stood out to me. To have a lively and robust artistic culture, there needs to be on some level a degree of social cohesion that allows for a common language of symbols so that we can actually talk to each other. Could you clarify that and maybe say more? I've been thinking about this lately. I've been thinking about the fact that whenever I write a piece, or anybody writes a piece for that matter, composers are always being asked to supply program notes, right? Why do we need to have program notes? Beethoven didn't have program notes. I'm fairly sure that Perrotin didn't have program notes. I'm pretty sure that Dufay didn't have to write program notes for his pieces. The program notes thing is emblematic of what I'm talking about. What that is really is that there's a kind of a lack of a sufficient degree of cohesion, a sufficiently strong context that would make program notes completely ridiculous and unnecessary and superfluous. And I think program notes should be superfluous, and in an ideal world they would be. It's the same when you go to an exhibit of paintings or any kind of modern art exhibit. There's usually an artist's statement. There's usually placards on the wall that explain to you what the paintings are. And in the old salons in the 19th century in Paris, you didn't have that, right? There were no minutely typed up little accompanying texts that would explain to you what you were looking at. And I think that that's a real shame. I don't know if there's anything to be done about that. It's probably impossible to change at this stage, because what we've seen is a splintering, an atomization of the art world into innumerable, very niche-y and very idiosyncratic different directions. And often they are so utterly different from each other that you simply can't assume going into something for the first time, encountering a new artist, a new composer, a new poet, or whatever it is, that you'll have sufficient background information and context and understanding of the genres within which they're working and the styles within which they're working that you'll be able to effortlessly slot into that world. It's impossible. So therefore, we have to sort of create this artificial context by constantly explaining everything. And I suppose I've contributed to that in my way through this channel by talking about musical analysis and by providing some of the context that's missing for some of these pieces. Like, for example, if I'm talking about a piece that was written in Vienna in 1914, then I might want to provide some context about the historical period, about the styles that were being practiced then, about some of the major figures that were active at that time that may have shaped the intellectual and artistic life of that time and place. And I might provide some of that information before I even start talking about the piece, because in all likelihood, the people watching the video were not alive in Vienna in 1914 and did not experience that firsthand. So there might be some very important aspects of that if I don't take a bit of time to provide that context, it's not going to be obvious to them. So that's basically what I'm talking about. I think there's a lack of a kind of a universal vocabulary. Not that these things ever were truly universal. I mean, obviously there are always regional styles and regional distinctions that apply in any artistic era. But it seems to me that whatever cohesion we may have once had has really vanished, and it's very, very difficult for me today to think of any artist, especially working in the fine arts, where you could really say, well, they're just comprehensible to the entire society from top to bottom. Everybody can kind of basically understand what they're doing on some level. We don't have that anymore, and so that's a big part of what I was talking about. Do you think if Beethoven had never existed, and what we know as his symphonies were written today by some American named John Doe, they would still be considered masterpieces, or would they be written off as kitsch, written in an outdated style? Many would agree that music in the classical style is timeless, but if you write music in that style today, many would call it outdated. How can a style of art be simultaneously timeless and outdated? It's an interesting question. It's one that comes up from time to time. So here's where I would start with that. So one of the assumptions in the question is that it's possible today to write a piece that would be essentially indistinguishable from something Beethoven might have written in 1810. And that the barrier to us appreciating such a piece for what it is a sort of snobbish attitude around, well, this is written in an outdated style because it's no longer 1810. And I really take issue with the premise of that question, which is that I don't think that's actually possible. I don't think it's possible to write imitation Beethoven today in a way that is convincing for all kinds of reasons. Just the most obvious being that it's more than 200 years later. We're completely different people now. It's a completely different society. The world has just dramatically changed since that time. And so I find it very strange, the idea that it would be possible to write anything authentic in that exact style today. It could only be kitsch. It could only be a kind of imitation of something that's already been done, and probably a much less successful imitation. What I do believe in is that the work of the past necessarily and permanently informs the work of the present, either consciously or unconsciously. This can be something that you absorb through your fingertips simply by being, existing within a certain culture, or it can be something more conscious that happens through deliberate learning and through deliberate cultivation of an understanding of artistic traditions. But what you're going to do ideally is take those things from the past, those elements from the past, and you're going to transform them and make them your own, right? So that you're not merely slavishly copying something that was done vastly better 200 years ago by someone who was living in a totally different world, but rather you're taking aspects of them, absorbing them, mixing them with other things, and obviously filtering all of them through your perceptions. And your perceptions, of course, are going to be attuned to the world that you're actually living in, which is not, the world of 200 years ago. So I've never seen anybody write a piece that was a convincing copy of something that Beethoven might have written. Now, you can do short little exercises that are sort of, in the same kind of style. Yes, you can do that, but that's not where the genius of Beethoven lies. The genius lies in the trajectory, the progression between works. The fact that he could go from something like the exquisite miniatures of the 8th Symphony to the 9th Symphony, which is, it's not a linear extrapolation, right? You can't extrapolate the 9th Symphony based upon the 8th, right? It doesn't work that way. It's a leap into the unknown. And that's what's fascinating about Beethoven is the progression, the change from work to work, the development of his thinking over time. It's not, taking pieces that are finished, that were finished 200 years ago, extracting out some of their stylistic features and then writing an imitation in that style. Like that's my answer to that. If somebody could write something somehow magically that was, a total transportation of the spirit of Beethoven into the contemporary day, but indistinguishable from what Beethoven would have written 200 years ago, and that person happened to be in America. I mean, this is so phenomenally unlikely that I can't even answer the question. Okay, so what do you think of Wolfgang Rihm? He recently died, and I've listened to him for a while, but I think he has an interesting work list that extends the Germanic tradition back into the realm of tonality. But it seems here in America that people don't know who he is, and it's a shame. Tonality. Look, tonality is not this monolithic thing. It's like, this is tonal, and it satisfies all the requirements of being tonal, and this other thing is atonal. And it's like, there's a lot of people that seem to conceive of music that way, where it's like, as soon as there's a triad, they're like, oh, it's tonal. No, like there's a whole bunch of things that go into making a musical style, right? There's tonality, or the particular way that you write harmony is one of them, potentially, but it's like, well, Schubert and Wagner don't write the same types of harmonies. Like they're extremely different from each other. What about Philip Glass? Is that tonal? Probably wouldn't fit the definition of any kind of classical tonality, even though he writes consonant music and writes lots of triads. So be careful about this idea of just labeling composers as tonal or as atonal, because these labels really don't mean anything very specific. And a lot of the music of Wolfgang Rihm that I've heard is not at all tonal in any kind of conventional sense. It's sometimes consonant. That's not the same thing. Anyway, what do I think of him? He was a genius. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. completely committed to music. He devoted his life to it and wrote an astonishingly long list of works, some of which are extremely fine. Do I have to go out of my way to say that the work list is uneven? Anybody who's hyper-productive and constantly producing music is going to have their ups and their downs. That's just the way it is. I think he's a type of creator of whom we could definitely use more. Somebody who is always working, always furthering their craft, always exploring, and who can, people who can write pieces the way other people breathe, where it's just a natural extension of themselves, and it's not necessarily some separate special event, but it's just something you're doing all the time. One of the things that really impressed me about Rihm was he once said that he didn't like to give interviews because the time he would spend doing the interview would be time that he would not be spending writing his music, and that's what he really wanted to do. And yeah, I put out a bunch of tweets about him recently, sending out links to some of his pieces and just sharing some thoughts about him in general. And I was also wondering out loud if that would be possible today. If you could have a figure who had the possibility of just sitting in a room by themselves, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, writing all these pieces, able to get these kinds of major orchestral commissions, and have that sort of sustained, uninterrupted concentration, decade after decade. I don't know. Maybe it's possible. I have to hope it is. But I think, our attention spans are being pulled in so many different directions all the time now. And we have to rapidly switch between things. And it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people, especially younger people, to sustain that kind of focus, that kind of attention that is characteristic of what Rihm did. It's the same with Stockhausen. He did the same thing. This relentless, laser-focused energy on one thing, for an entire lifetime. Anyway, no, Rihm was amazing. Do you have a favorite piece amongst your own works? If so, which one and why? I really don't know. I really, really don't. I don't think of it that way. I don't think of my pieces as these finished little objects that, that I can say, oh, here's verifications, here's in like seclusion, and they're like little boxes that I can sit next to each other. I just don't think of it. I think of it as a continuum, as a continuity, and as a process with which I've been engaged since I was, I guess, 18 years old. So that's a long time now. Some of them are more musically convincing than others, for sure. I'll be the first to admit that, but I don't have favorites among them. I think that each of them is a part of me. It's part of my own personal evolution, for better or for worse. And I recognize myself in everything I've written. I think that they are, whatever their qualities and their weaknesses might be, I think that at the very least, they really are authentic, and they really are a reflection of me, of my expression, and of my particular interests. So that's what I can say. What is good writing for voice in an atonal framework? Well, good writing for voice in an atonal framework is the same as good writing for voice in a tonal framework. There's no difference, right? And in order to write effectively for voice, and rule number one is you need to understand the voice, right? You need to, and that sounds obvious, but it's actually not that obvious for a lot of composers. What does it mean to understand the voice? Well, it means, for one thing, understanding the different timbral qualities, the different capacity for projection in different ranges of the human voice, understanding where you can place particular vowels in different registers, consonants also. Where do you place the high note in a phrase? Where do you place the low note in a phrase? How do you create a compelling melody that can engage your listeners? These things are all the same, regardless of what harmonic framework you're working in. If it's modal music, if it's 12-tone music, if it's the sort of purest four-part polyphony, the things that make a melodic line interesting and engaging are the same. What I will say is bad vocal writing, first of all, doesn't take account of any of those things typically, but also there are a lot of composers, and I'm not going to name names here necessarily, but there are a lot of composers who approach the voice in much the same way as they would approach any instrument. They'll write a soprano part, but it's indistinguishable from what they might write for clarinet, for example, or for violin. And they don't take into account the physical aspects of what you have to do in order to make a huge leap in a vocal line. What about the comprehensibility of the text? How do you ensure that the text is comprehensible if that's a priority for you? So no, I think largely it's the same, and I don't find that the success rate in terms of amazing vocal writing is necessarily higher in people writing consonant music as opposed to chromatic music. I think that the pitfalls and the difficulties are not actually all that different from each other. I saw you on a podcast discussing the decline of art. Perhaps I'm playing the devil's advocate here a little, but could this be attributed to atonality? A person on the street can't tell the difference between random banging on keys and Schoenberg, whereas the greatness of Mozart is immediately apparent. Can art be saved by a return to tonality? Have you considered returning to tonality in your own music? I'd be interested to know what podcast you're referring to, because I don't think I've specifically spoken about the decline of art in general. I think whatever I was saying was probably quite a lot more specific than that. And as for your contention that the person on the street can immediately appreciate the greatness of Mozart, I would also take issue with that. I don't think that's the case. I don't find that random people necessarily have a high degree of appreciation for composers like Mozart. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. Lots of people are deaf to music. Lots of people are deaf to art and to aesthetics, and it's just they're not attuned to that at all. And that's fine. People have different personalities and different things that they're interested in and sensitive to, and art is not always one of them. Now, I'm sure there's going to be 1,000 people in the comments saying that, yes, but nevertheless, Mozart is more immediately appealing than Schoenberg. Yeah, maybe, probably, I suppose. But that doesn't really tell me anything specifically, so I'm not particularly interested in that argument. The idea that art needs to be saved, first of all, and that a return to tonality would be the way to do that, also, I think is very, very peculiar. I don't think that, tonality in terms of the amount of room that takes in people's consciousness, the consciousness of average people, I think is not a very big concern. I don't think too many people are particularly aware of or listen to much chromatic music. I think this is, by and large, even if you take the music of the entire 20th century into consideration, like how much mental room do you think people would really devote to the music of Alban Berg or Webern? Like, would they even have heard of them? Would they ever have heard any of their works? I don't know. I think it's extraordinarily marginal compared to pretty much any other musical genre you can think of that would have a vastly greater listenership. So I don't think that you can attribute the music of Schoenberg to any kind of decline of art. No, I think that that's an impossible argument to make. He's just not widely enough listened to by enough people, I think, for that to be the case. What long-term impact do you think World War II had on German composers, and what is the current state of composition in Germany and Austria today? Which notable current German composers do you recommend for us to listen to? Obviously, the impact of World War II on German music was colossal and far-reaching and profound. In all sorts of ways. The Second World War was do I have to say it? It was a profound calamity for Germany, and it resulted in the total restructuring of musical and cultural life. So I don't think that it was possible for anyone who is an artist or a composer in Germany in the post-war era to escape, on some level, the consequences of that war. As for the landscape today, it's an interesting question. There are two very major German composers who both recently died within months of each other. Wolfgang Rihm, who I talked about earlier, and Aribert Reimann, who is a great German composer, mainly of songs and operas. And they were giants. And I don't know that there's anybody today on the German scene who is equivalent to those figures, who has a kind of a similar stature, a similarly extravagant work list, and a similar public profile. I don't really see it. It doesn't mean that there aren't figures out there, but I'm not aware of them. So I think probably the situation in Germany and Austria is not that different from the situation in most European countries, which is that the musical scene is fragmented and splintered and has a lot of different parallel tendencies going on. And probably one specificity of Germany is that they've certainly, been very interested in multimedia and in exploring new technologies, and maybe more, to a greater extent than other neighboring countries. As for Austria, well, Austria is a very small country with a very small population, and it's probably, about on a par with Switzerland in terms of the number of major figures that have emerged out of the country. Yeah, I think there are distinct local scenes in Austria that are interesting, out of Graz, for example, Salzburg, Vienna. But it's a much smaller country than Germany, and I don't find that the musical scenes in all of these different countries are necessarily connected by the common language. I think that they're actually fairly distinct from each other. I'm curious, in case you're familiar with the subject, about your perspective on Adorno's critique of the commodification of art in capitalist societies and its subsequent shift in a problematic direction. Do you find merit in his arguments, or do you hold any critiques of his position? Additionally, do you believe some of his predictions have become reality in our time? Well, Adorno was clearly extraordinarily prescient and observant, and a lot of the things that he talks about in the philosophy of new music and his other essays in music, which you can read in Quasi Una Fantasia, for example, are directly relatable to our current situation. Absolutely, he was extraordinarily observant. Adorno had one major limitation, which is that he was completely insensitive to and deaf to popular music. He viewed it as being automatically a kind of vulgar and artistically debased and inevitably commercialized product intended for a mass audience, and by that very fact, by the fact that it was intended for a mass audience, incapable of anything, resembling an actual artistic, an actual authentic artistic expression. And if you look at popular music and different styles of popular music in America, for example, in the 20th century, there's a great deal of nuance there that I think he was just completely deaf to. Yes, there's a lot of purely commercial music whose intention is to make money and is to sell as many copies as possible, whether it's sheet music or whether it's a recording or whatever. But then there's also a vast body of work, a body of music that is popular, but not necessarily commercial in its orientation. Like, what do you do with the Delta blues, for example? Like some of the Delta blues was undeniably commercially successful, but there were also a lot of really great bluesmen who were, obviously authentic, great artists, and who weren't primarily motivated by a desire to make money. Like they were expressing the culture of their time, and they were providing a voice for many people. So it's like this idea that anything popular or is automatically commercial and vice versa. I think that there's a great deal of nuance there that Adorno simply does not address at all. It was something that he either did not understand, or he saw it only through the lens of where the time and place that he was born in, where you had this sort of exalted, sublime music that aimed for the very highest things in human nature. And then you had this kind of light music tradition, this sort of cheap dance music that was sort of schmaltzy and not very interesting. And it could be that he sort of saw it through that lens and was simply not aware of, or was ignorant of, or was insensitive to the fact that you can absolutely have totally authentic popular expressions that are not primarily commercial. And sometimes those things overlap, right? There's an authentic popular expression and there's massive commercial success. Sometimes they overlap a little bit, sometimes a lot, sometimes not at all. And there's so much nuance there that is just not addressed by him at all. And that's a huge shame, I think. That's a massive thing not to have understood. The musical 20th century belongs to America. I mean, like, there are so many things that happened there that originated there. So many different traditions and genres and styles that came out of America in the 20th century. And to kind of put that all in the same bucket as being just, commercial mass market art, I think is unfortunate, to put it mildly. How do you feel about being part of the Peterson Academy? Well, I'm delighted to be part of it. I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't delighted to be part of it. Obviously, I met a lot of extremely interesting people as a result of doing that, and I got I got an opportunity to teach people who are curious about the classical music tradition and don't necessarily know very much about it. And I don't see a downside to that. I really don't. I think it's an amazing initiative. I think we'll probably see more things like that as time goes on. And I see it as being part of the democratization of culture. And it's one of my guiding principles as a human being and as an artist, that I think that these things should not belong only to a very small number of specialists, which is unfortunately all too often the case, and they should be popularized and made accessible to everybody. So the Peterson Academy was an extraordinary opportunity to do that in the best possible circumstances, with extremely high production values and with a dedicated team of incredibly competent people. And I'm honored and delighted to no end to be a part of it. Do you consider musical composition a high-level intellectual activity, comparing it, for example, to the most abstract mathematics? Well, sometimes it depends on who's doing the composing. And it depends on what their preoccupations are. I mean, music is a multidimensional art that can cover all kinds of different things, right? It's partly an intellectual activity. It's partly an activity of the spirit. It can be entertainment. It can have a scientific dimension to it. Some music is highly intellectual. Some music is not intellectual at all. It depends. So that's it. Do you foresee a time when more composers within the Western classical tradition opt to form and play in their own groups as a means of getting the music out there? To what extent is this being done today? To what extent has this already been done beyond Zappa? Yeah, so the idea that you can be a composer who sits at a desk and writes scores and other people play them, I mean, that still exists as a possibility, and lots of people do that. It's not necessarily optimal, and I think that there are lots of other possibilities that exist now that are probably, more compelling, or that could be more successful models moving forward. In order to be able to sit at a desk and write pieces and other people play them, and that's fine, you need to have a whole team of people around you that are helping to make that happen. For the first thing is you need to have collaborations with ensembles and with performers that are robust and durable. You need to have probably a publicist and a publisher, and you might need to have a record label as well. And you might need to have an agent in order to get those commissions in the first place. And of course, you also need to have festivals and ensembles and orchestras that already exist that are willing to take a chance on your work. And again, there are people who do that, and it still basically exists as a model, but I suspect that moving forward, we're going to see lots of other models emerging that may be more robust than that one currently is. So for sure, if you play an instrument and you're a charismatic and compelling performer, and you can make a strong case for your work, and you're willing to go out on the road and tour, that's a colossal advantage. Obviously, as opposed to if you're like a more introverted type of person who has to work at a desk and is dependent on other people to get their music out there. It's possible. It's way harder. I have always struggled with the idea of evolutionism in art, that new art ought to evolve and be better than prior art in order to be validated as worthwhile. Art is also a craft, and it seems that good craftsmanship is disregarded compared to evolutionism. What do you think? Is it a problem that artists continually have to reinvent the wheel just in order to be regarded as genuine? No, it's not a problem. That happens automatically. It's like artists are a mirror of the times within which they live. That's just, I don't see how you can subtract the artist somehow from their context, just completely divorce them from the time and place that they're living in, the people that are around them, the perceptions that they're having, the things that they see on a daily basis, just sort of somehow magically remove them from all of that and put them into some kind of a bubble. It's not possible. So, by necessity, automatically you're going to respond to your particular set of circumstances, and your particular set of circumstances have never existed before. So if you're producing art that is just a carbon copy of things that have already been done, or that is kind of a pastiche, then what you're doing is probably minimally creative, and it might not even be art. It might be, it might be something else. It might be a kind of like maybe closer to the applied arts than an actual artistic expression. And that's fine. Like we need people to make elevator music and hold music when you're on the phone and so on. And it's not particularly expressive or interesting, but it fills a purpose. And there's also, various types of commercial music for which we need, very highly standardized types of musical production. But no, for any kind of creative pursuit, by definition, you're creating something. You're not simply copying things that have already been done. And the problem is, it's not me that you need to hear say this, but things eventually become corrupted and cliched. Like styles become corrupted, cliched, and empty over time if they're not renewed. If there's not something that will allow them to continue to grow and change and develop. And it's the same with human beings. It's like if we just do the exact same things over and over again, day after day, and generation after generation, and nothing ever changes, then things are going to get a little bit stale and not very interesting. And in any way, it's completely counter to our nature as humans. I think by nature we are born to explore, and we're born to try new things and to always push farther out into the unknown. That's what we do. So why would you expect art to be any different? 100 years from today, how do you think the 21st century in music will be viewed? What direction does music seem to be heading? What will the defining musical discourse argument of this century be? Which 21st century composers do you think will be considered central to the canon, like Schoenberg or Stravinsky are to the 20th century? There's not going to be a Schoenberg or a Stravinsky of the 21st century. Forget that. That's not going to happen. They lived at a time when there were vastly fewer composers who were active, vastly fewer artists who had any kind of professional activity, and at a time when, as I mentioned earlier, there was a much higher degree of social cohesion. There was the possibility of having a shared symbolic language, at least to some extent. That's not the case anymore. And the internet is one of many factors that I think has completely changed that particular game. And it might still be possible to somehow take this highly dispersed, highly fragmented landscape and glue it back together and find a way to address large numbers of people in ways that are immediately striking to everybody. You can do that to an extent in commercial music. As far as fine art music, I don't know, maybe, but I don't see anybody currently on the horizon who can do what Stravinsky or Schoenberg did, not because they're less talented necessarily, but the world is just so utterly, vastly different today. As for the way our current century will be viewed in 100 years' time, I think, well, who knows? We're not very far into it, but one thing that I would say is that the musical production that I see around me and the things that I'm listening to, it's a vast ocean of countless niches, personal idiosyncratic styles, and every conceivable stylistic, technical, and expressive orientation. What's going to remain of that in 100 years? Anybody's guess, and I'm not the person to make that guess. What is the line between good production that hides a bad song and a bad production that ruins a good song? Wow, that is an excellent question. I mean, all of these questions have been interesting. That is a really good one. The production is part of the song. It's part of the composition of the song. I think production is basically orchestration, but I mean, it's more than orchestration, obviously. There's a lot more that goes into it, but it fills a role that is maybe analogous to the role of orchestration in the classical repertoire. So I would view that as being part of the composition. So if a song is really badly produced, then it's probably not a great song. Or if the production doesn't, on some level, make it compelling, then it's probably not a great song. Like let's take one of my favorite albums, White Light, White Heat by the Velvet Underground. I love that album. Is that a well-produced album? Well, if your yardstick is that it should be, technically clean, then obviously not. It's one of the, dirtiest sounding records ever made. Everything is distorted. Everything is clipped. There's leakage over all the tracks. It's, et cetera, et cetera. But that particular production style that they opted for, and it was very much a deliberate choice, is perfect for that material. That's what it should sound like, and it's amazing. So I think it's not an example of that's a badly produced recording or whatever. No, it's perfectly produced for what they were doing. So I think these things need to work together on some level if you want to have a great song. And you can't sort of hide a bad song with a fantastic production, and you can't sort of make a fantastic production survive. It's not possible. Those two things go together because they're components of the same thing, as far as I'm concerned. And finally, did you ever meet Henri Dutilleux? How has his music influenced your own, if at all? I did meet Henri Dutilleux on 2 occasions. I won the last Dutilleux Composition Prize back in, I don't even remember what year it was, maybe 2012, 2011. So that was obviously a great honor, and that was a major thing for me that helped to kickstart my career as a composer. And I knew many people that were close to Dutilleux towards the end of his life. He was very, very old at that point, and rather infirm. And nevertheless, he did have a certain vivacity of spirit that was evident even in his last years. And he was very, very energetic, very present, and it was amazing to be around someone like that. I have to say his work did not influence me at all. It made no impact on my own production whatsoever. It's very far from me stylistically, very far from me in terms of what my musical interests are. I appreciate it immensely. I appreciate tremendously his dedication to the art, his extraordinarily high artistic standards. The demands that he placed on himself were very, very, very elevated all the time. He was a slow, meticulous worker. The pieces, the best pieces are magnificent. They're magnificent expressively. They're beautiful. They're novel. The cello concerto, I think, was probably, and Métabole, those are 2 pieces for me that stand head and shoulders above the rest. The string quartet too, Ainsi la nuit, is a great score. So I appreciate the qualities of those pieces. I think he was, no doubt, a great composer, one of the great composers of the 20th century. It's had 0 impact on me in my own production, but I love listening to it. I think he was a great artist, and of course it was a great honor to get a chance to meet him. So, everybody, I'm so grateful for all of your interesting questions, for the continued support of the channel. It means the world to me, and you've been very patient with this extended period of silence, and you're going to see a bunch of new things coming up very soon on the channel, including a very big production, which I can't say more about right now, but I'm going to endeavor to produce things a little bit more regularly. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.